Hello everybody, I'm super excited to share with you an analysis of a brand new opening which I named the Gandalf Gambit. Please bear with me, this video may be a little long, but I'll try to cover as many traps as possible. And boy, there are so many traps with this opening. Okay, so as you've seen in the intro, the way to play this is to first get into Icelandic Palme Gambit. So after knight to f6, white needs to play this c4 move. If they play anything else, I'm sorry, but no Gandalf Gambit for us. But after they play c4, black continues with e6, which is known as the Icelandic Palme Gambit. And after white takes, black usually retakes with this light square bishop. But in our opening, the Gandalf Gambit, we play a rather ridiculous looking bishop to c5. Now, you may or may not notice this, but the bishop on the c5 square is actually wearing a big pointy hat, which is the pawn on the c4 square, hence the naming. Yes, that's Gandalf. At this point, the majority of your opponents will simply accept the gambit and take on f7 with check. And that's the correct thing to do for white. I mean, the engine likes the best to play first knight to f3 and then takes, but it's just going to transpose to what we wanted anyways. Kindly note that if they play anything else but don't accept your gambit, they don't get any kind of advantage out of the opening, and most likely the game will transpose into equal middle game. So because of that, today I'm only going to focus on the accepted line. So white takes on f7 with check. Now here's a pro tip. If you are playing this online in Blitz or Bullet or whatever time control, you need to stay a little bit confused for a few seconds right in this position and don't retake immediately. Just stay there and try to look confused like you messed up something, and only then you retake with your king. It will help them to blunder on the next move, believe me. Alright, so here we are. This is what the Gandalf Gambit accepted line looks like. And now you might be wondering, why on earth would anybody willingly play into this position? Well, yes, you are kind of right. Black is down 2 points of material and he has his king on f7. But in reality, there is very strong compensation for this. The compensation is so strong that white in this position has only one move to hold on to his advantage. Believe it or not. Let me turn on the engine so you can see for yourselves. So right now in this position, white can only play one move to hold on to his advantage. Then there are two kind of equalish moves that grants equality or more or less equal game, and anything else will be borderline losing or even losing badly right away. So the only move for white in this position is knight to f3, because he wants to prevent us from going queen d4, which is a very strong move in many of our positions. But first, let me talk about some really bad blunders that white might play right away. So probably the worst move they can try to play in this position is b3. If they play b3 thinking that they are supporting the c4 pawn and they are preparing the dark square bishop to be fiancatoed, but this move loses on the spot because of the queen d4. And now we are not only hitting the rook, but we are also threatening checkmate on f2. And white cannot stop both of these threats. A similar mistake would be if they would try to fiancato the light square bishop and play g3. You can see the evaluation is -10 almost. So for this one, we first give a rook check, so they block it with something, and then we can play queen d4, And as you can see, they cannot stop us from hitting the f2 pawn. Pretty much if they play any pawn push in this position, they are losing, except if they play d3 or d4. We will look at those moves later. If they play, I don't know, maybe h3, you can even sack your bishop right there, because they have weakened the g3 square so much because of this pawn push. Alright, but the truth is that they are not very likely to play such pawn pushes in this position. More likely it is that they will blunder something like knight to c3. Very normal looking developing move, and it loses on the spot as well. There are two ways how you can punish this move. The first variation is when you play a rook e8 check. Now they have to block it with something, so let's say they block it with their bishop. Then you can bring the queen to d4, threatening checkmate on f2. So let's say they try knight h3 to stop you, but you simply take this knight off with your bishop. And now the best thing white can do is simply to castle and accept the fact that they are playing this game without a knight. At this point you simply retreat your bishop and you are crushing them. In few of my games, my opponents went for a different strategy. So after queen d4 threatening the checkmate, they went d3 to give their king some breathing room, but you simply take on f2, the king goes to d2, and now you take on g2, threatening the rook, and you are also crushing them. Now let me go back to this initial c3 move, which is a blunder. There is another way how you can punish this, and this is my personal favorite. You go queen d4 right away, and now you force them to cover the f2 square with their queen. So queen goes to f3. Now you can bring your rook to the e file and give a check, so they block with the bishop. And now you can just harass the queen like crazy. So first you develop your bishop to g4, threatening the queen. Now notice that the queen needs to stay in touch with the f2 square, because we are threatening to take with our queen. So they need to go to g3. Now we go knight h5, threatening the queen once again. At this point, the engine wants to sack the queen and go queen e3, which you can take with your rook. But I don't think anybody would play this. I think everybody would play rather queen h4. So staying in touch with the f2 square and running away from the knight. Now we can play knight f4, and we are threatening to fork from the g2 square. So what can white do to stop this? Well, they have to go back with their queen to g3. And now, let me just show you, if they would take the bishop, you can go knight to d3 check. And after the king moves somewhere, you still win the queen with this fork. So it doesn't matter. Let's go back. So now at this position they would go, I think, back to g3. Well, now you have this move, bishop to d6, and you are x-raying the queen once again, threatening some discoveries. Unfortunately for them, the queen has no square to go and not to be taken by force. So the only thing they can do to prevent us from taking their queen is to move their king, so it doesn't get checked. So let's say king d1. Well, now you can take on e2, threatening the queen with both bishop and knight. So in order to save the queen, once again they have to go to h4, and now you can take their knight on the c3 with check, the king goes to c2, and then bishop on d1 is checkmate. A beautiful line in my opinion, which I never got to play because everybody blunders their queen earlier than this line. Alright guys, let's go back to our initial position of the Gandalf Gambit accepted. So that's after we retake the pawn on f7. And we've just looked at the move knight to c3 and how we can punish this. So another common blunder that I often see is when they play queen to f3. Now on first sight, this move looks really strong, as it is pinning our knight to our exposed king. It also attacks the b7 pawn, so our light square bishop cannot really develop unless we are willing to hang our pawn. And often white gets this kind of mentality that we have just played a really retarded opening and they want to punish us quickly and checkmate us quickly, and that's why they often play this queen to f3. But as you can see, the evaluation, it is already losing. So the quickest and most practical way to punish this move is first play rook e8 check, so now they gotta block it with something, and then we can develop our knight to c6. No matter what they play, let's say they play the best move in this position, which is knight to c3, we can play knight to d4, and we are threatening not only the queen, but also the c2 square, which would lead to forking the king and the rook. So they might naturally play queen to d3 and try to prevent us, but then we hit them with bishop f5. Now, if you notice, the queen is very short on squares, and the only square that she can run to is g3, but after simple knight h5, the queen is trapped. Alright, let's go back. So as you saw, queen to f3 is no good for white. And another typical blunder is when they start to be aware of the potential of our rook to come to e-file and develop with the tempo, and if they want to prematurely block the e-file with something, which is very common thinking process of my opponents, and they try to block the e-file with the bishop or the knight by playing, for example, bishop e2. As you can see, it is also a losing mistake. Simple refutation of this move is to play queen d4, threatening checkmate on f2, and the best thing they can do is actually play knight h3, and we've seen this already. We just snap the knight off the board, and now they have to castle, and after we bring our bishop back, we are up a piece and we are winning this game easily. Alright, so let's go back and let's see what happens if they try to block the e-file with their knight. Now this one is a little bit more tricky than with bishop, but bear with me, I will explain all the ideas behind our attack. So we still want to come with our queen to d4, but we cannot right now because it will be taken by the knight. But we can prepare the move queen to d4 by playing rook to e8 first, pinning the knight to the king. So now if they allow us and they play some random move, for example knight to c3, we can immediately jump to d4 with our queen and we are crushing, as there is no way for them to stop us from taking on f2, and there will be just a massive king hunt. So what they need to play is to play d4 to stop us from coming down to d4 with our queen ourselves. So if they successfully found this move and played d4, we are going to capture the pawn with our bishop, and we have a new threat. And our threat is to capture on f2 with the bishop. So once again, if they just play some random move, let's say they play bishop to g5, we can capture on f2, forcing the king to take our bishop, and now we can win the queen on d1. Tada! So they cannot again play just some random moves. After this capture, they need to play knight to c3 in order to get their queen protected. Right? So if they try, for example, bishop to e3, it doesn't work because we are going to win the exchange and we'll be winning. So because of this, knight to c3 is the only move for them to play, and afterwards we can develop our knight to c6 and we look for a couple of plans for the next few moves. So for example, we would like to play bishop to f5, knight to b4 and threatening knight to c2, as well as we would like to play knight to g4, and if they allow us, take on f2 with checkmate. So because of these plans, the best solution for them is to counteract our strong bishop and to play bishop e3. After this move, we are simply going to take the bishop. Now they should exchange the queens to relieve some pressure, and after that they are going to capture our bishop. Now we have a strong move, knight to b4, and we are threatening to jump to c2 with the fork. And there is not really a pleasant way to deal with this. Actually, the only good way and not losing way to deal with this is to walk the king to f2. But trust me, they are going to be trying the other moves. So for example, if they try to go knight to d4, we can simply kick this knight away with our pawn. If they try to cover the c file with the rook, they simply walk into this other fork. And if they try to move the rook to d1, well, they walk into this check, and now they can decide either to come with their king and get hit with this discovery check, or they can simply give up their rook for our knight, which is the better way. So in any case, if they manage to find the best move and play king to f2, we can now play our rook to d2. So we have our rook on the second rank and we have much better position. Okay, so let's rewind this all the way back to our initial position. After they accepted the gambit, there is one last move I would like to consider as a early blunder, which actually happened in the very first time I played this gambit, and my opponent played bishop to d3. He got really confused out of the opening, and me being just as confused and being prepared to play the queen to d4 at any cost, I played the queen to d4 and didn't even realize that the bishop on d3 is actually just simply a free bishop. But I managed to win the game afterwards. Alright, so now that we have covered all the basic early blunders by white, let's see some other moves. Mainly the two moves that the engine thinks leads to equality, and that is pawn to d3 or pawn to d4. And I will show you how tricky it can be for white anyway. So if they play d3, I would suggest you play the next line. First give this rook check, and now they gotta block this check with the light square bishop. If they block this check with their knight, they are simply losing. And if they block it with the dark square bishop, they are also losing. There is a funny line which I'll show you. Here you can play knight to g4, and they can play queen to f3 check. You go king g8, and they can go queen to d5 check, forcing a queen trade. Afterwards, you simply crush them with the move knight takes on f2. So the bishop cannot take because it is pinned, so king takes on f2. Now you can take the bishop with check. The king doesn't want to go to e1 or e2 because it would walk into a discovery. So king to g3, and now you can go rook f8, threatening the light square bishop. Light square bishop may go to e2, and then, tada, bishop f2 checkmate. So that's just a funny line I wanted to share with you. The point is, they need to block this check with the light square bishop. That is the only move. And now you can bring your queen to d4, and once again the only move is to bring the other bishop to e3. After this, notice that their b pawn is hanging. So you are going to capture with your queen, and once again the response from white is forced. They need to play knight to d2 in order to protect their rook. And at this point I suggest that you sack the exchange, take the bishop on e3 with your rook. So they are going to recapture with their pawn, and now you get your bishop to e3, and this way white is never going to castle. So that's the whole point of this sack exchange. And also there is a little trick. If they try to harass your queen with the rook, they are losing. Or even if they try to exchange queens with the move queen to c1, they fall for this trap of bishop takes on d2, and after queen retakes, you win the rook and you are up a piece. So once again, in this position, they need to play correctly, and they need to play knight to f3 to overprotect the knight on d2. And from here, well, the engine says the position is equal and you are playing a game of chess. But just notice how crumbled the position of white is, full of threats. Alright, let's go back and let's analyze the other move, which is pawn to d4. So after this we are simply going to capture with our bishop, and once again we have a nasty threat. So if white plays just some kind of random move, let's say knight to f3, we are threatening to take on f2 with check, and if the king takes, once again we win the queen. If the king doesn't take and go to e2, we simply force the king to capture the bishop by going rook to e8, and we win the queen this way. So because of this threat, white cannot play just a random developing move. They need to play either knight to c3 or bishop to e2 to have their queen covered. If white plays knight to c3, I'm so sorry, but this is going to be the most boring line out of this gambit. Because the best thing to do for us is take this knight with check, so we force white to damage their pawn structure, and now we force the queen trade, and after this we play this endgame where white is up a pawn but has a very bad pawn structure and is lacking in development, and black on the other hand has a more active king, more active pieces, and also the engine slightly prefers black in this position. Okay, let's go back and let's analyze what happens after white plays bishop to e2. Now we get to have all the fun after we play knight to e4, and we are threatening the f2 pawn. And believe it or not, there is no good way for white to hold on to that pawn, and they simply need to let it go. If they try to hold on to it via the move knight to h3, we are simply going to take the knight, we damage the structure, and we are still able to take on f2. But just remember, it is more precise to first develop the rook to f8. White should castle at this point, and now we will bring our king to g8. Nice safe square, and we have all the threats, and we have winning position. Alright, what happens if they try the other move to hold on to the pawn, and they will play bishop to e3? Well, now they hang their b pawn, so we are going to capture with our bishop on b2. And now you can notice that the queens are staring at each other. So what happens if white tries to exchange queens? Well, guess what? It is totally losing for him. After this, the best shot for white is to give up the knight like this in order to save the rook and kick our bishop away. A better move for white is to try to play queen to c2. With this move, they are threatening the bishop and as well our knight. So they might be thinking that they are getting out of the trouble, but that is not the case. We are going to shock them with the move queen to f6. And now they might be like, whoa, he just hung his knight, so let me take it. Well, if they take the knight, now we are not even going to capture the rook, we are going to play bishop to c3 check. And guess what? The king needs to hide on f1 after this check. But who is going to play this when they can simply capture our bishop, right? Well, if they capture our bishop, we are going to recapture with the queen, so it's a check. And if they foolishly block with their bishop, we can now take the rook with check, force them to block this check with the other bishop. Now we unleash the cruel plan that was all the way there, and that is rook to e8, and on top of everything we are winning the queen. Something similar can occur after they are not going to take our bishop, but rather block the check with the knight. We are going to take the knight. Well, they are going to most likely recapture with the bishop, but now once again we take the rook with check. Now bishop to d1 is forced, and once again we can win the queen this way. Alright guys, let's go back once again. So because of these reasons, white cannot really hold on to his f2 pawn, and the best thing white can do is to develop the knight to f3. After this we are able to capture on f2 with check. The king needs to go to f1, and then I suggest that you swap the queens, so the bishop takes, and now you can play rook to d8, threatening the light square bishop. Now a very logical response from white would be to play bishop to c2, threatening our knight. So they would go for this tactic and try to remove the defender of our bishop on f2. But after this we can simply retreat our bishop to b6, and now white cannot really capture the knight. If they try to capture it, we have this deadly rook to d1 check. Now there are two moves white can play. The first one is king to e2, and we simply win the rook. And the other move is to block the check with their knight. But now we can capture the bishop on c1, and although the material is equal, the position is winning for black because the white pieces cannot really develop and the position is frozen for them. Alright folks, moving on, or moving actually back in time to the initial position of the Gandalf Gambit accepted. We've just covered all the wrong moves that white can play after accepting the gambit, namely all these pawn pushes, knight to c3, bishop to e2 or knight to e2, and queen to f3, and how all these moves are actually losing badly for white. And if they play d3 or d4, we can easily get them into a really uncomfortable positions where we can get some kind of initiative very quickly. Now I would like to focus on the correct move that white should play after accepting the gambit, and that is knight to f3. By the way, only half of your opponents are going to play this move, knight to f3, according to statistics. The other half, well, have fun bullying those guys after they blunder on move 6. But let's see the main line. So knight goes to f3 to prevent us going queen d4. The main line should continue with knight to c6, but let me just briefly touch on a funny sideline, knight to g4. I don't really recommend playing this move, but if you want to have some fun in Blitz or Bullet with lower rated opponents, why not play this knight to g4? The point is that the only move for white now is d4 to deal with our threat of capturing on f2. And now we are going to play knight to c6. Crazy looking move, best move for black. You can actually pre-move knight to c6 as you are going to play it anyways. And you want to make it look like a blunder. So white will, without second thoughts, capture the bishop on c5. I like to call this the Moria Variation because in the movies, after they went through Moria, Gandalf sacrificed himself. So the thing is, they cannot do this because of the tactics. Queen takes queen, king takes queen, and you are going to win the rook and be up in exchange. Funny thing is that the engine still slightly prefers white, but from practical point of view, black is the only one who is going to be having some fun in this game. One of my games went like this. King went to e2, I took the rook, and trust me, the mentality of your opponents is going to be the same. They see a trapped knight in the corner, they are going to go after him like crazy. And that is actually not the correct way of playing this position for white. So, in this game, my opponent continued immediately blundering g3, making it clear that he wants to go bishop g2 and snap my knight. I responded with rook to e8 check. Now of course he doesn't want to move his king because the king is controlling the getaway square for my knight, so he blocked with his bishop. And then I developed my bishop to g4, creating yet another pin. He continued with his plan and he went bishop g2 and I played knight to d4 check. Funny move, utilizing all the pins in the position, he had to move his king as the knight cannot be captured. So he went king d3, I took this knight, he took my knight, I took his bishop and he took this knight. And after all these exchanges, there is one final blow, a useful move, which happens a lot in Gandalf Gambit. Rook goes to the opposite side of the board, making the white position unable to develop. And even though the material is kind of equal, you see the problems are on white side and black is winning. Alright, this was just a fun sideline I wanted to share with you. But the thing is that after knight to f3, knight to c6 is the way to go. Now, the best continuation for white in this position would be to go bishop e2 and then simply short castles. They have to make sure their king is safe first, and after that they can focus on development and creating attack. But trust me, there are going to be those greedy and aggressive opponents who will try to punish you quickly for your retarded opening, and they will go for moves like knight to g5 check. So this move does look appealing, just going after the weak king, but this is no weak king. This is Aragorn, and he's not going to hide in a corner. He's going to join the fight and he's going to g6. The point is we don't really want to block in our rook. So that's why king goes to g6. And now white is the one who needs to be careful as there is only one not losing move for them. And the move is d4. But for example, in one of my games, actually much higher rated opponent with more than 2000 elo tried to go for this quick kill with queen c2 check. As you can see, it is a fatal blunder. He was probably thinking that I would capture this knight for free, which is actually a foolish move to play, and I would be checkmated in 8 moves. But that didn't happen. I countered his attack by developing the Legolas to f5. You see, white cannot really play aggressively against Gandalf Gambit. They need to play defensively, just make sure the king is safe and catch up with development later. Just to quickly show you how the game went, I harassed the queen furthermore like this, then I took the pawn. I got my bishop to d3 so he couldn't castle, he went h4, I gave him a check which he blocked. I took the bishop, he took the bishop, I gave him this check with the rook. and then he went king f2, and this is forced mate like this. So you see, even higher rated opponents can easily underestimate the power of Gandalf and try to go for this aggressive plays, and it doesn't work for white. Let's go back to the main line. So after knight to c6, they should go bishop e2. Now, there are two approaches from which you can choose. The first one that I'm going to show you includes rather risky but brilliant trap. So bear with me. In this variation, I suggest the move rook to e8. Now white should simply just castle, because that was their point, to make sure the king is safe. And now we are going to play knight to d4. So we are threatening the light square bishop. If white would try to support the bishop with the rook and go rook e1, this is actually a losing mistake, because we can play knight to g4, and we are threatening some sacrifices on f2 square. So for example, if now they would try to kick this knight away, we can sacrifice it on f2 square. We are threatening the queen, so let's say the king would take, and now we will take the knight on f3 with the discovered check. The king cannot simply go back because knight to h2 is checkmate, and also the king cannot take our knight because queen to f6 check, king to g3, and bishop d6 checkmate. So they cannot play this rook to e1. Most of the players will, I believe, just trade off this knight and you recapture with the queen. Now, there are two moves that make sense in this position for white to play. The first move is d3, to make sure to make room for the dark square bishop to join the game. And the other logical move is just developing a piece, knight to c3. So let's have a look at knight to c3 first. Here we have an opportunity to play aggressive, or maybe even overly aggressive move, knight to g4. Stockfish hates this move, but from practical point of view, what we are doing, we are threatening the f2 pawn with 3 pieces. And the most human and natural way to deal with this pressure is to simply trade off this annoying knight. So that's what usually my opponents do. Now after this trade, the queen is hit. So let's say the queen moves to c2. And now we have a deadly move. And this deadly move looks so innocent. It is actually king back to g8, and we are threatening checkmate in 2 moves. Crazy, right? And very hard to spot for white, because if they see this position for the first time, they may not realize this threat, and they may go, for example, for natural looking knight to b5, trying to create some threats against our queen and threatening to fork our rooks. But now we finish them off with the brilliant move queen takes on f2 check. So of course white can choose which way they will be checkmated. King to h1 and queen takes on f1 checkmate, or the prettier one, rook takes queen and now rook to e1 checkmate. This kind of trap actually can occur with different moves or different order of moves. All you got to do is make sure you have this battery against f2, the rook is prepared on the e-file, and the f2 pawn is only supported with the rook and the king. That way this queen sack can work in different positions as well. I got this trap played around 20 times, and I played the Gandalf Gambit 200 times. So 10% of my opponents actually fell for this trap. Alright, let's go back. After we hit their queen, actually it depends where the queen moves, because for example, if they would play queen to b3, now there are even stronger moves. Although you could still play for the king to g8 and the same trap, it could work. But In this position, after queen to b3, you can play queen to e1 right away. And the point is, they cannot capture your rook, because obviously queen takes on f2 and there will be a checkmate. So the best thing they can do is actually to play knight to d1 to cover the f2 square, but now we simply take the knight. It is a free knight, the rook still cannot be captured, and we have a crushing position. The same would apply if the queen would go to a4. You are still threatening this rook to e1, and actually now it is a forced mate in 12 moves, the stockfish 11 moves, the stockfish says. Alright, now you don't really have to go with this variation, knight to g4. If you want to play something more solid, you can develop the bishop to g4. That is the stockfish top choice, if you don't want to play this risky trap. Let's see the move d3. Well, for this you can still go with knight to g4, with the same idea of pressuring the f2 pawn with 3 pieces, so your opponents are likely to exchange this knight for the bishop, and after this they need to move the queen somewhere. So now the best square for the queen is b3, after which we can now play rook to e1. Or if you'd like, you can still try to go with the same trap with king g8, and then making sure to have this battery against f2. But the best move and best continuation is to play rook e1. Now they have only one move which is not losing, and that is to bring bishop to e3. After which you are first going to take the rook with check, so the king retakes, and now we will play queen to e5. This is another little tricky move. They cannot simply exchange bishops because queen to e2 check, and there is a checkmate, of course. And they cannot even simply just develop like knight to c3 happened in one of my correspondence games, because now you can capture the h2 pawn, and actually queen to h1 checkmate is threatened. So in this game my opponent continued with knight to e5, making sure he has something to block the checkmate with. Now I took this bishop, and there is a hilarious line here. According to Stockfish, the best shot for white is to take on b7 and threaten the rook, after which black can help white to capture his rook by going rook b8. So white captures the rook, and now the black goes bishop to f3. It's like we don't even like to play chess, we just want to blunder all our pieces as quickly as possible. And the best solution for white at this position is to hang their queen like this. Because anything else white plays, there is going to be a checkmate. So for example, if this bishop is captured, then this is checkmate, and if the other one is captured, then this is checkmate in 2 moves. It just cracks me up how funny and ridiculous this position can get in chess, especially with the Gandalf Gambit. Alright, let's just rewind this back to this position. So after we hit their queen with the bishop, if the queen moves to a4, this is actually even worse for white, because after rook to e1, now bishop to e3 doesn't work. Let's see why. Bishop to e3, we snap the rook with check, so they have to recapture, and now we are able to capture the b2 pawn. And we are not only threatening the rook, but also all kinds of forced checkmates. So because of this, they would now have to bring the queen back to c2 to cover the f2 square, but we can now play bishop to e2, and as you can see, we are also threatening all sorts of forced mates, and the best thing for white to do is to give up the queen for the bishop. Okay. What about queen to c2? Well, in this line we have this forcing move, rook to e2. Now we are threatening the queen and the f2 pawn as well. They have actually the only move, which is to go for the queen trade like this. We will delay the queen trade by playing rook captures on f2. Now they have to swap queens, no other way for them. We will once again delay this by capturing the rook with check, so the king recaptures, and only now we recapture the queen, and we have this endgame with two strong bishops, and white has zero development. And although they are one pawn ahead in material, black is the one who is going to have all the fun pressuring white in this endgame. Alright. If you are not a fan of this variation, which does involve a risky move, you don't have to go through this. You can go with a more solid variation. So after bishop to e2, there is this move knight to d4 right away. Now white could castle in this position, but you are going to win the bishop pair and even develop your rook with a tempo on the queen, so I don't really see anyone playing this variation, but as you can see it's pretty much equal. More likely they will just trade this knight and you retake with the queen. Now at this position they have to castle, and now I also suggest this move knight to g4. This is the way that even a titled and strong player, CM Piscatorix, plays. And the thing is, we are once again building pressure against f2 pawn. Believe me or not, but the best way for white to handle this is to play knight to c3. Now this makes no sense for any human. There are three pieces attacking the f2 square and you just simply develop a knight to c3. I don't think anybody would play this. More likely they are going to play either h3 or simply take this annoying knight off. After that you can retake the bishop and hit the queen, so we develop with tempo. Now if for some reason the queen goes to the e-file, well, you can bring your rook to the e-file, and then they might just resign because it looks like the queen is trapped. Well, in reality there is this move, queen to e3, and you better not take this queen. That would be losing for you, because after pawn retakes it is a check and you are losing your queen as well and end up in a worse position. But don't worry, you still have a strong move in this position, and that is bishop to e2 hitting the rook. Now they cannot take the bishop as it is covered with the rook on the e8, so they would have to go for the queen trade, and after this they cannot simply save their rook. If they try to go rook e1, you are going to take the pawn on c4, and now they still have to give up the rook by going rook to e3. If they trade the rooks, they end up in a losing position because you are now threatening this checkmate, so now they would have to move some of these pawns, but you are still just going to crush them with this strong bishop pair. So because of this, I don't really think that anyone would move the queen on the e-file. They have to move the queen somewhere on this diagonal. So let's go move by move. If they go the worst one, which is queen to a4, now rook to e-file is coming, and there is actually no stopping of the rook, and the rook will go to e1 square and just crush white. And actually with this position we have safely transposed to the variation that I was showing you earlier. So let's say d3, rook e1, they have to come back to c2 with the queen and bishop to e2 is crashing. And if knight to c3, rook to e1, now they have to go with this knight sacrifice, knight to d1, and rook takes knight. So I don't really need to explain this, as you've already seen it. Let's have a look at the other move, which is queen to b3. Now we have a strong move, bishop to e2. And the funny thing is, the best move for white is to go for a queen trade like this. And now we can bring the rook to the h file and look at this. Do you remember this line? Now they are in the line where they have to give up the rook. If they try the second best move, which is d3, now you can take this rook. They cannot recapture with the king, as queen to f2 would be checkmate. They have to go with bishop e3. Now you can go queen g4, and I wonder how many people would fall for this and take the free bishop, and you can mate them on g2 in a funny way. But of course, king takes on f1 is forced, and after this you can take this bishop, they retake with the pawn, and rook to f8, threatening discovery check, and you have a winning position. So let's go back and let's discuss queen to c2. Well, for this one we are once again bringing our rook to e8, and now this is actually likely to transpose to what we've just seen. For example, if knight to c3, we can go for our brilliant trap of queen sag on f2, and if d3, we can go for the line with rook e8, and they have to go for this queen trade. I don't really want to explain all of this again, as we've already looked at these lines. Maybe worth mentioning would be if they try to kick your bishop away with h3. This is a losing mistake because they didn't prevent us from going rook e1. And now they have to play like d3 and now bishop to e2, and they have to give up some material in order to survive. Alright, let's go back one last time, as there is another variation I would like to show you. So after we played knight to g4, we have just discussed what happens if they trade the knight. Of course, the best move, which is really impossible to find in my opinion, is to play knight to c3. And then there is this variation if they play h3 and try to kick the knight away. If they play h3, this gets really exciting, because we can play h5 and play this variation in the spirit of the fishing pole trap. So the point is, of course, that the knight can never be taken with the pawn, as I don't really think I need to explain this to you. Let me just first show you the best moves for white, and afterwards we will look some variations where they can go easily wrong. So the best move for white in this position is once again knight to c3, after which we will develop our bishop to f5, and then the best move for white is to go knight to b5 to harass our queen and threaten the pawn on c7. Here we have a great move, which is queen to e5, and we are of course threatening checkmate, and the only way to deal with this is to take the knight with the bishop. Now if they try to block our mate with g3, of course we are able to take this pawn thanks to the pin that our bishop, our Gandalf, creates. So bishop takes, knight on g4 is forced, and now this allows us to open the h file and unleash some really nasty stuff. So white actually has only one move to survive at this position, and that is to play pawn to d4. Let me just show you what are we actually threatening if white plays something else. So let's say white plays just simple pawn to d3, very natural looking. Well, now look at this. Rook takes on h3 and we are threatening checkmate. So white better capture this rook with the pawn, but now queen comes to g3 with check, king h1, queen takes with check, king goes sadly back to g1, and now rook to rook to h8, and there is no stopping checkmate. So this is how nasty this can get if white is not careful. Let's just see the correct move, pawn to d4. We are now going to bring the queen to f6, and white most likely will say, hey, I won the bishop. Well, now we can abuse the open d file by going rook to d8, threatening the queen. And what is the best thing to do for white at this position? Well, it's crazy, but the best thing is to actually hang their knight on d6. I don't think anybody will play this against you. They are most likely to move their queen somewhere out of the danger, right? So let's say, I don't know, wherever the queen goes actually, let's say to b3, we are now able to capture on h3, and after something like queen to f3, we are also going to capture the pawn on g2 and just open up this king. Now they gotta recapture with the queen, there is no way out for them. And now we can simply bring the bishop to h3 and we will be winning exchange. Well, if the queen goes somewhere to, for example, g3 and we win the exchange, actually the king cannot even recapture our bishop because we are once again crushing them after something like rook to h1 check. Okay, I don't want to go any deeper than this. So the thing is, if white isn't going to play the best move, which is knight to c3, what are they going to play? It's hard to find any good move for white in this position. But let's just say they would go d3. That looks kind of natural to try to develop the bishop. Well, in this case, we can simply go with the basic ideas I just told you. We want to go queen e5 and threaten checkmate on h2. So bishop takes, knight is forced, and this way once again we get to open the h file and crush them with this attack. Well, of course the pawn can never be taken. The line that the engine suggests here is rook to e1. Now our queen can comfortably sit on f6 and pressure the f2 square. So the best thing that white can do is go bishop e3, and at this point we don't even care about material, we just want to open up this white king and we take on h3. So they can have our bishop, but we will continue with taking the pawns. And here you see the only move for white is knight to d2. Are they going to find these only moves? I highly doubt that. So you will get this crushing attack and have all the fun just creating threats after threats, and I don't see white surviving much longer than few next moves. Anyways, this video is getting pretty long, so let me just stop right here. I think I went through all kinds of traps, and I hope you enjoyed this analysis of this brand new gambit.
I hope you will be inspired to try to play this line. If you do so, please let me know in the comments how your game went. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me anything. Thank you for watching, take care and bye.